Welcome, my lovelies, to part 2. Nathan speaks to Rob Hanson from CSIRO.
This is the Analysis in Change with Nathan Williams and Neil Kieran.
Last time, I had been talking with Rob Hanson from CSIRO in Australia. CSIRO is a research organization that does a lot of technical research in Australia, and Rob and I had just shared a panel discussion in Perth at the Africa Research Forum on the potential of blockchain to affect development in the African continent. Now this is part 2. In part 1, Rob and I had been discussing how technology moves much faster than the academic world or the regulatory world. We were discussing specifically how we could engage the academics to move more quickly in their adoption of blockchain. And now my question is regulation moving too slowly to keep up with technology?
It's what happens with the law. The law is reactive. It's not extremely responsive. You get a change in the environment, and then we get case law, or we get people that legislate. And so with technology, you often have a situation where people put in innovation, it does good stuff, but then slowly policy starts to get made, then regulation, then legislation, generally in that order, to create societal response to that technology. How do we get people involved in that conversation, or what did I see today? I saw quite a vibrant conversation today. I was actually quite excited by it. I saw lots of people asking questions, fairly informed questions about how do we use technology, what role does it have, where does it sit within our society. How do you get these sorts of conversations to be more vibrant? How do you spread them? I'm not entirely sure. I wish I knew. But I think places like this are quite useful for that conversation. I just hope it's beyond the academic realm. I think there's, particularly in Australia, unfortunately, things can get labelled as being academic and then therefore not being seen as being pragmatic. I think that's unfortunate. I think there's quite a conversation that can occur between the academy and between industry, and also inclusive of government. But it occurs to me that we don't necessarily have the interdisciplinary folk out there that we need. I think they are out there. I've met quite a few of them. There's some exceptional people, particularly in places like the UN and other places around the world. I hope that what we're doing at the Institute will build a new cohort of people that can think across the disciplines, can think in ways that produce more value. My concern is, and I think I've expressed this several times today, is that there is the potential for people to come up with a great idea, for that to be super successful, for there all of a sudden to be millions of users for a particular app or platform, but then for something to happen. And we've seen examples of this. We've seen, there are quite famous names out there of organisations where we weren't quite sure what we were doing. And I say we, I'm talking about the consumers at large, the users of the internet, got involved, and we thought we were there for a reason, and it turned out that there was a business model and that we were part of that business model, and we weren't quite sure how we fitted into that. And then something happened and we've gone, oh, okay, it's a bit of a different world. But that's part of where we are, right? So as we are dealing with this disruptive wave of technology, it's a learning process, right? It's a collective learning process, and we all need to adjust to that. I'm just wondering if there are ways for us to be more responsive, to be proactive in this space. And to me, the way to do that is to think about things in an interdisciplinary fashion.
It's interesting because, we were having this conversation in the startup scene in Berlin 5 years ago when the big disruption was Airbnb. And people were talking about how regulation was slow to to catch up, and the economic model changed, and the regulatory model was sort of walking behind, and we viewed it as the regulatory model was sort of built to protect old industry and in a way served to stifle innovation. The reality is that it's a big gray area, that both things are true. It was there to protect consumers as well, but it did stifle innovation to a certain extent. Now what we're seeing is an exponential increase in the speed of this adoption of technology, especially with blockchain and Bitcoin and how fast it is moving, that it goes across borders, that it goes across seas, and it allows individuals to hold and keep value or invest in value in all sorts of things that they couldn't have invested in before. And I almost wonder if, I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist by any way, but at the same time, I do see this as contributing to a lessening or a changing of the role of the traditional state.
I think that is quite an astute observation. I think that's a line that I'd like to go down. I just want to cover off on a few things that you said before we do. I think that you're right. I think that there's a certain amount of conservatism out there, and that's just a generational change thing, right? So as technology provides new functionality, this is something that people have to come to grips with. As it changes the world around them, they then come to grips with that, but they're not necessarily going to know about how that works beforehand. The challenge is we're starting to see a much larger and more rapid increase in change. Technology is becoming faster, cheaper, more connected. There is far more capability for you to do things out there these days. And the structures of our society, whether they be institutions which are industrial or institutions which are part of the state, are taking time to come up to speed with this rate of change. And I think that as people become more familiar with that, we'll become more flexible. But certainly we are in a disruptive period. But yes, I agree with where you were headed. Did you have any comments in that space, or?
No. This is what happens when two podcasters record each other and interview each other at the same time. No, I mean, yeah, it's disruptive, basically. I don't know.
Yeah, well, what I'm seeing, what I think I'm seeing, is that there's an adoption of technology by the state. This technology does two things. One is, when we adopt technology by the state, to a certain extent we're outsourcing thinking. We're going, let's automate this decision-making process, that decision-making process, whatever that is. It could be a low-order automation, it could be a high-order, input to some sort of decision-making activity. When we do that, we need to be very careful about the decision-making process that we've outsourced, and that we understand what's going on there. So sometimes, and there's been some famous examples about this, like the compass example, where it's a black box and we're getting outputs and we're using those outputs to make decisions, and there are quite large impacts from these decisions, right, on people's lives. And whether we're talking about whether or not somebody goes to jail and how long they go to jail for, or whether they're getting insurance or they're getting a loan, they're quite large fundamental life decisions and inputs to the quality of people's lives. If we're not across this, if we don't understand what we're doing, there can be problems there. And I was talking before about the fact that there needs to be an alignment between technology and the law, and I said that was a reactionary process and it takes a while. One of the things that we do have is things like the International Bill of Human Rights. We do have things that we've agreed, these are inalienable rights that people have and should be upheld. And then we have a series of treaties, conventions, and all sorts of mechanisms to try and make that happen. It does occur to me that we could potentially get better at the way that we include that into our design process. When we think about technologies, and you were talking before about we can use blockchain to create value and store and exchange it and all those sorts of things, and that's fantastic. And that's the direction that we should be heading. But at the same time, we're starting to record information, and there's potential there that the way that we record that information and the way that information gets used into the future could transgress some of these rights. And so if we think about what we're doing a little bit carefully, then potentially we can create that value without running into issues further down the track. The second thing that I wanted to talk about there was the fact that sometimes when we start to build technology and we build in different types of biases, which was that compass example too. If we build in biases to the technology, and sometimes we do this unconsciously, but sometimes we do this intentionally, right? So if a nation state goes, right, I'm going to create some type of system that's going to do certain things, and again, it goes into a black box. And when I say a black box, I mean we have this application, we have this system, this platform, and it's making decisions, it's creating outputs. But it's not necessarily clear how that decision-making process was created. There's potential there for what one jurisdiction thinks is okay, for what their legal system says, for what their cultural values say, for the way that they think about things, to start to be transmitted and projected onto other jurisdictions and organisations, and potentially create outcomes which maybe on the surface appear okay, but that other jurisdiction may not know necessarily why that particular judgment was made. And so we start to see a projection of power, and if we're not careful about that, we could have detrimental outcomes, and it does take a very long time to unpack these things. Again, the compass example caused great social harms, but it took quite a lot of effort to unpack what was going on and why that system was biased at the end of the day.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here, Rob, but I have a question. First of all, what's the compass example?
Oh, certainly. So the compass example, it's an acronym. I forget the name of the full acronym, but essentially what happened was there was a system that was acquired by multiple jurisdictions in the United States, principally departments of justice, and what they wanted was a decision-making system that would help their courts and administrations make deliberations on parole, upon bail, and upon sentencing. So an offender would go before a judge, and the system would say, this is our decision on their chance of recidivism, right? So this is how likely it is that they'll reoffend. And so based upon that, it would say then, give them parole or don't give them parole, that type of thing. The challenge there was the system was procured from a third party.
And you don't know how the third party made the decision?
Exactly right. So the third party said, our stuff is proprietary, you can't see what it is.
Might as well just use an AI at that point.
What they did do was they used historical data. And so they said, it's okay, it's fine, we're using historical data sets, everything's fine. Well, the historical data was unfortunately biased because they were using law enforcement data, and the law enforcement data was, in many instances, racist. And so the outcome was, if you had an offender who wasn't white, who came before the system, then the machine decided you got a far harsher penalty than somebody who was white. And it was quite black and white, and it took activist organisations quite a while, because they could see what was going on, but it took them quite a while to fight to get people to understand that the system was actually skewed.
These are challenges that we're definitely going to face going forward. I mean, from my personal point of view, I don't want to necessarily have to think through and be an expert in government or policy. I want to be able to trust the experts to have my best interest in mind. Unfortunately, this has been proven time and time again to not be the case. I mean, the reason Bitcoin was started was because of a group of crypto anarchists who, in 2008, realized that they can't trust the financial system right in the middle of the crash, and they were right. We want to trust the financial system, but everyone was basically gambling with our money. And whenever I look at the Bitcoin bubble, when we go on a bull run and the price spikes and people are going out and making ICOs, it's peanuts, absolute peanuts compared to what was being gambled with in Wall Street with regulated federal level institutions and the global economy. And this is why, it is still very interesting in spite of the potential for abuse. I still look at this as a danger on the right road. There are people with really good projects who are going out trying to make either cryptocurrencies or blockchain-related technology projects or infrastructure, and there's going to be scams along the way. And the reason that gets a lot of sight is because when a scam hits, it hits people directly in their pocketbooks. Whereas if a scam happens in Wall Street, you don't really notice until it's become so big that it causes a global economic crash.
Yeah, I agree. It's because we're talking about something which is novel and new, which is why it gets all the attention. It's newsworthy, and so people focus in on that. My concern with the technology is I don't think it would take that much for there to be some sort of blemish on the brand of blockchain for people to back off from blockchain. Go on.
I maybe, but I mean, we've already had some blemishes on the brand, and it's still here. Bitcoin at the beginning was a cryptocurrency used on the Silk Road to buy drugs, but when the Silk Road was shut down, Bitcoin kept going up, and then there was BitConnect, and there was. I don't even want to go through all the different scam coins and stuff because they're not worth naming them. But the market took hits at that point, and then it recovered because there were a lot of legitimate projects and an underlying technology that fundamentally changed things. What I'm seeing now is an attempt, usually from people within the industry, to separate themselves from the negative projects, from the scams. I actually see that as a mistake. I also see a lot of people trying to separate blockchain from cryptocurrency, which I also see as a mistake. Because for me, the interesting blockchain applications are the ones that change the incentive models, and to change the incentive model more often than not, you need some sort of token. Like if you're truly decentralizing. If you're just being a centralized company that happens to be using blockchain, you don't need a token, but that's not the ones I really find interesting, to be honest.
So I'm interested there in a few things. One is the whole term cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Do you see cryptocurrency as a currency?
It's sort of a catch-all term. Honestly, when you're using cryptocurrency, it can refer to coins or tokens. It can refer to asset tokens or utility tokens, and those are all distinct categories. Mostly, I will use the term coin to refer to the native token of a primary level blockchain, rather. So, Bitcoin. Probably more accurate would be to talk about something that is intended as a currency, as a coin, so like one where you're not expecting it to go up in value, but I mean, everyone's expecting Bitcoin to go up in value, so I think that the definition I use is okay. A token is usually something where it would have some sort of utility, right? So a utility token within a system. An example of it might be where you have to stake tokens in order to have voting rights, or if you are rewarded with tokens that are built on someone else's blockchain. So, like if you build on Ethereum, and I would also include security tokens there as well, which would be representative of assets, like either equity, present ownership in a certain commodity, or representing one for one a real world asset, like a bar of gold or a vintage car. So
I think that's interesting. I think that the definition of cryptocurrency is important. I think there's a whole lot of definitions in this space that need to be established for us in order to have robust conversations where we're not sort of, chasing around the mulberry bush trying to work out what it is that we're talking about at the end of the day. The other fork that I want to take, if you pardon the pun, is around is around things like cryptographic sortition.
Cryptographic sortition.
Cryptographic sortition. So, I forget his name off the top of my head, the professor from Cornell who came up with the Algorand solution, who went, if I made Bitcoin today, how would I do it? And he went, I'm going to use this cool thing called cryptographic sortition, and let me describe that for the listeners. So, cryptographic sortition is very much like everybody's wearing a Harry Potter sorting hat. So, at the moment, with blockchain, with the proof of work mechanism, it's a race. And we have a race to try and make sure it's random. We don't want to know who's going to win the next block, and that removes the fraud. So everything is we can trust the system. So we want a system where it's random. We don't know who's going to be next, but we want to try and remove all of this computational power we currently have to try and solve that problem. Because at the moment there's an awful lot of power and computation that goes into that, and we're seeing at the moment a commercialization of the current proof of work blockchains out there. It's being skewed towards the big mining pools that have all of that power, and so they're the ones that are winning most of the blocks. With cryptographic sortition, what happens is it's essentially a lottery. Everyone's wearing the Harry Potter sorting hat, and every round, when it's time for the next block, what we have is the sorting hat whispers in your ear if you're in essentially a United Nations Security Council that comes together and goes, right, let's sort out this next block. So let's say there's 22 million people involved in the blockchain. You need 8 people to do your verification of the block. It grabs 8 people. You all come together. You go, right, do the transactions going into the block meet the business rules? Is everything above board? Is it all good? Yes, great, okay. We all agree this is the next block. Bang, done. We now move on. And the next round, it's a completely different group of 8 people that get selected. And so we have randomness. It's a trivial overhead, so we don't have all this computational power going on to do that work. And it doesn't fork. The other issue is...
Sounds like BFT.
Well, similar but different. And in this case, it seems to be quite robust. And so I'm excited by it. I think it's got a lot of potential.
From my point of view,
Yeah.
I would say that every consensus algorithm has its own trade-offs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are tens of cryptographic protocols for consensus out there, and each one of them has pluses and minuses. Usually you're trading off a level of trust for a level of speed. And with proof of work, it's sort of the gold standard for trustless. But even that, it's not that there's no trust in the system, and it's just that there's no trust needed in the algorithm, or no trust needed in doing on-chain transactions. If I'm giving you Bitcoin, usually it's not for no reason. I usually want to buy something from you, and so either I have to go first, or you have to go first, or we need escrow, and so there's, there is trust in that transaction. But for me to give you the Bitcoin, that's where there's no trust required. When you're talking proof of stake, you're trading off, depending on whether it's delegated or not, like you're basically trading off the democracy of the system toward the people who have more coins and who got in earlier and who are richer. If you're talking BFT, you're trading off a level of trust, because you can't just have anyone join, but it has to be maybe people who have an interest in the system moving forward, or like for example Ripple, where it's mostly banks that are there, or you have proof of elapsed time, or proof of interest, proof of accessibility if you're making data available, or proof of hard disk space. There's all sorts of these proofs, and each one is just a little bit different. I don't get excited about any of them anymore, because I don't think there's a magic bullet. I think it's going to be a matter of certain ones will solve certain problems.
I think you're right, and to me, I wonder if there's a research question there around what consensus algorithms are useful for what situations. So,
Absolutely.
I see that there's lots of different use cases, lots of proofs of concepts, people using things in different ways. I wonder if the cryptocurrency, having a token that you give someone as an incentive, I wonder if that's a complicating factor here. I wonder if there's not more simple, more elegant ways of using blockchain to produce value than having to create or amplify these sorts of ecosystems and marketplaces for these tokens.
Well, I think it depends what we mean as incentive. This is something I've given a fair bit of thought to, that all blockchain systems that I've seen so far have centered around the idea of incentive being financial. But if you talk about what motivates people, there are other factors. You've got financial motivation, but you also have desire to fit in as part of a group. You have the desire to be important. You have the need for autonomy, for mastery of your given craft, to have a higher purpose. And so no one has played around with these as far as I know. But I remember someone coming up to me, not one person actually, multiple independent people coming to me with this idea of motivating people using blockchain to do charity work. And if you're motivating them with tokens, then essentially what you're saying is, I'm going to pay you to do charity work. And I was like, that doesn't work. That's not why people do charity work. They do charity work in order to get the story that I have helped this person, in order to feel that they're part of an elite group that is helping, in order to have a higher purpose than just their own self-interest. And, think of why do people become Wikipedia editors? They're not getting paid for it. They're doing it because they are masters of their craft and they're part of a very elite group that is guardians of human knowledge, is the way they look at it. And I think that there's something that can be done in terms of incentivizing that sort of motivation that hasn't been explored yet.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. And I was thinking through as you were talking about that, I like the idea of the autonomy and mastery that you were talking about, and I was wondering about how that could be harnessed. And to me, it seemed that the transparency of blockchain and to want of a better word, the accountability, so the fact that people's actions are recorded and visible in this location. If that's part of that, if that's part of the way that you can start to tap into that sort of motivation.
Well, I'm just thinking in terms of how many people lie about their accomplishments. What if you had a way of immutably proving that what you accomplished or what you helped with is actually true? I mean, I could see people going for that.
Well, that's something that we're interested in at the Institute and the Australian National University more broadly, is around micro-credentials. Lots of people are talking about this. Lots of people are very interested in it. I think that if you're going to start looking at that type of thing, you need a way to verify. You need a way to prove to people that this thing is legitimate and that it's come from somewhere. And I think that needs to be backed by some sort of institution at the end of the day to say, yes, you can trust that. But I think there needs to be mechanisms that are far more accessible than what we have now for academic transcripts and for certifications to say, yes, that's actually true.
So, key takeaway as we wrap up, key takeaway from the conference today.
Key takeaway. Key takeaway. Interesting. I like the research question that was posed at the end of the day in terms of could we start to think about a repository for use cases? I think lots of people have speculated on use cases. I think we're starting to see more rigor in the way that use cases are starting to be collected and analysed. But I think perhaps moving into some model where people could interact like a wiki, maybe on a blockchain, we could start to go, look, here's how these things work, and start to put some flesh on those bones. And that might start to provide some of these examples that then could spawn further work by other people to go, oh, that's something that I can pull off the shelf and tinker with and apply for my given situation. I think that we heard today that there are some limitations and constraints in some parts of Africa which are not issues in other parts of the world, like only having electricity for a couple of hours a day, or having issues with a lack of infrastructure in terms of poles and wires and those sorts of things, and coming up with novel applications of these consensus algorithms we were talking about and other ways the infrastructure could run. But if that's thought through and then provided in a trusted manner, then that collective learning could take place and we could start to see applications which could be quite useful.
For me, I think it was just seeing that people are open to this new way of doing things. However, understanding the African context is important, and there's not one African context, it's a giant continent, and just understanding that in some places you'll have limited access to technology, in other places you don't have roads or basic infrastructure, and these needs need to be met before they can think about adopting a cryptographic computer technology, magic electrocurrency, but at the same time that people still are talking about the potential for leapfrogging and taking advantage of the next level of technology because they're not being held back by the existing layers of infrastructure that have been invested in the West.
I think there's a lot of promise in the potential, and I'm quite excited on where it could go.
All right. Well, it was a pleasure meeting you here, Rob. And
it's good meeting you too, Nathan.
Nice to interview you, and nice to be interviewed by you.
Certainly. Thanks a lot.
All right.